The Christmas Hair, Salon Murder, a Miss Marple mystery. Welcome, dear listeners, to another enchanting Miss Marple mystery. I'm Sam, your host, and it's such a pleasure to have you join me this evening. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to know a little about you. What's your story? Are you a retired teacher, a baker, a painter, or perhaps someone with a craft all your own? Share it in the comments. It's always wonderful learning more about our warm and curious community. Now settle in, find a cozy spot, and let's step together into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. A Frosty Morning in St. Mary Mead. The first light of morning spread gently over St. Mary Mead, washing the rooftops in pale gold and silver frost. The air was still and sharp, the kind that made chimney smoke hang low above the cottages before drifting lazily toward the church steeple. Inside her sitting room, Miss Marple sat beside the window with a cup of tea, watching the world wake from its slumber. The crackle of the small fire kept her company, and a single robin perched on the garden gate puffed proudly against the cold. It was, she thought, the sort of morning that asked for quiet reflection and perhaps a slice of toast with marmalade. But even as she stirred her tea, something felt slightly amiss. The church bells began their usual 8 o'clock chime, yet the rhythm was off, quicker somehow, uncertain. Miss Marple tilted her head, listening. Bells, she often said, reflected the mood of a village. Today they sounded anxious. Beyond the glass, a young constable hurried past, his boots crunching over the frozen path, scarf flapping behind him. Miss Marple's eyes followed him until he disappeared around the corner that led to the high street. It was rare to see police about at this hour, rarer still to see one running. A few minutes later, Mrs. Bantry's maid appeared down the lane, clutching her shawl and whispering to the milkman, who paused mid-delivery. The murmur reached even through the closed window pane, that distinct, rippling hum of news not yet confirmed, but far too delicious to keep. Something, it seemed, had happened. Miss Marple rose, setting her cup upon its saucer with care. Now, she murmured to herself, what could disturb St. Mary Mead so early, on so fine a morning? She crossed to the small writing desk and straightened the stack of correspondence there, though her mind was far from letters. Outside, the lane filled with the usual sights of daybreak, the postmistress opening her shutters, a child dragging a reluctant dog, and Mr. Thomas sweeping his shop steps. Yet everyone moved with a curious energy, glancing toward the square where the Golden Comb Salon stood. She reached for her shawl, wrapping it snugly about her shoulders. Years in the village had taught her that gossip was like ivy. Once it began to climb, it reached every window in no time at all. And if the bells were right, if the constable's urgency meant what she suspected, then today would not be ordinary. The sound of footsteps echoed up her path, firm, deliberate, and familiar. Miss Marple waited, her hand resting lightly on the door handle. When the knock came, polite but hurried, she was already smiling faintly. When the young constable knocked on her door, Miss Marple already had her coat in hand. By the time Miss Marple reached the village square, a thin crowd had already gathered outside the Golden Comb. Breath rose in pale clouds. Snowflakes clung to wool hats and coat sleeves. The familiar sign above the salon door swayed slightly in the breeze, its painted gold letters, once cheerful, now dulled by frost. Curtains had been drawn tight, and a length of police tape fluttered weakly, the only motion in the still morning air. Mrs. Bantry stood at the front, wrapped in her fur-trimmed coat, her expression torn between shock and a certain excitement she could not quite conceal. When she saw Miss Marple approaching, she beckoned her close with a gloved hand. "Jane," she whispered, voice trembling. "It's dreadful, absolutely dreadful. They've found her, Miss Bartlett, dead in her own salon. Poor woman." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Miss Bartlett? Surely not. She was only trimming Mrs. Price's hair yesterday afternoon." Mrs. Bantry nodded gravely. Yes, but this morning the postman noticed the door ajar. He thought it odd, so he peered in. The police are inside now. They say there's no sign of forced entry. The murmurs around them thickened. Fragments of speculation, half-truths and hushed tones drifting through the crisp air like smoke. Heart attack, someone suggested. Robbery, said another. Jealousy, whispered a third, as though even the word itself might summon scandal. Miss Marple listened, her expression composed, her mind quietly sorting the details. No forced entry meant familiarity, the kind of trust that unlocked doors. She glanced at the windows, clean, unbroken, their edges dusted with frost. Then, through the half-open door, she caught a faint scent carried on the wind. It was floral sharp, oddly sweet, not the usual lemon hair tonic Miss Bartlett favoured. Lavender water, Mrs. Bantry murmured, wrinkling her nose. Overpowering, isn't it? They say it's all through the room. Miss Marple's brow furrowed gently. Lavender water, a scent Miss Bartlett never wore. The remark was quiet, almost idle, but those who knew her recognized the tone. It meant she had noticed something that did not fit. The constable emerged then, young and flustered, his notebook trembling slightly in his hands. Best move along now, ladies, he said, though not unkindly. We'll have statements later. His boots crunched in the snow as he hurried toward the station, leaving the villagers to their whispers. Miss Marple remained where she was for a moment longer, watching as the snow began to cover the scuff marks near the doorstep. She noticed the faint glint of something beneath the overhang, a small piece of glass, perhaps from a broken ornament. It shimmered briefly before disappearing under the growing white. Mrs. Bantry shivered. Jane, do come in for a cup of tea. There's no sense standing about in the cold. In a moment, Miss Marple said softly. I'd like to remember how it looked, just so. Things change so quickly once the talking starts. The church bell rang again, its sound heavy with winter air echoing across the rooftops. The village of St. Mary Mead, so peaceful an hour ago, seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple turned at last, her expression thoughtful, her eyes lingering on the darkened salon window. Somewhere inside that quiet room, she knew, a story had already begun to unfold, one told not in words, but in silence, scent, and shattered glass. Chapter 2. The Ladies and Their Secrets. The following afternoon found Miss Marple seated in the vicarage sitting-room, where the fire burned low and steady. The kettle hummed softly, and the scent of orange peel drifted from the teapot. Inspector Craddock had agreed to let her speak, in her own quiet way, to the 3 women who had been in the salon the night before the tragedy. He understood by now that Miss Marple's questions reached places the law could not. Mrs. Weatherby arrived first, the postmistress, neat as a ledger. Her grey coat matched the steel-rimmed spectacles that perched on her narrow nose. Such a shock, she said, smoothing her gloves. I only stopped in for a trim before supper. We were all laughing about the power cutting out. Poor Miss Bartlett, she seemed well enough then. Miss Marple nodded, eyes calm. You recall what time the lights went out? Oh, about 8:10, Mrs. Weatherby replied quickly. I remember because the clock in the shop stopped just then. When it came back on, the hands hadn't moved. Miss Marple's brow lifted a fraction. And did Miss Bartlett say anything after the lights returned? Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. Only that she'd had enough of Christmas customers for 1 year. She laughed, of course, but rather thinly. The next to arrive was Miss Anne Drew, a slight young woman new to the village. She twisted her handkerchief nervously, eyes darting toward the fire. I hardly know anyone yet, she murmured. Miss Bartlett was kind to me, always gave me a discount. It was so strange last night. The thunder, the lights flickering. There was thunder, Miss Marple asked. Yes, just once. A long roll over the hills, Anne said. It startled me. Mrs. Weatherby said it was the wind rattling the chimney. But I know thunder when I hear it. Miss Marple offered her tea, letting the silence stretch before she asked, Did you notice anyone pass the window while you were there? The girl thought, then shook her head. No, only the reflection of the lights when they came back. And I thought I smelled lavender, just faintly. Lavender? Miss Marple repeated mildly. Anne nodded. It reminded me of my grandmother. I thought perhaps Miss Bartlett used it for cleaning. When Mrs. Price bustled in, the room seemed suddenly smaller. Her voice carried before her, cheerful yet eager. "I said to my husband, didn't I, that nothing good comes of keeping shops open past dark?" Poor Lily Bartlett, working herself to the bone. Though she wasn't alone, you know. Miss Marple stirred her tea. "No? Oh, there was someone at the back door. I heard it close just as the lights went out. Thought it was that delivery boy from Bath who brings her combs and things. Handsome fellow, too." Mrs. Price winked. "She never mentioned him, but you know how people are about appearances." Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed thoughtful. "Indeed, Mrs. Price, appearances can be most deceiving." When the three women had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long moment before the fire, listening to the faint tick of the clock. 3 women, 1 room, and 3 different versions of the same 10 minutes. By the time Miss Marple returned to the vicarage that evening, the frost had drawn delicate ferns along every window pane. Inside, the fire crackled, and the faint chime of the mantel clock marked the slow drift of hours since morning. She set her knitting aside and drew a small notebook from her reticule, a simple thing, lined with her careful, slanted handwriting. She began to arrange the day's conversations in order. Mrs. Weatherby, power cut at 8:10. Miss Drew, thunder, lavender, no one passing by. Mrs. Price, door closing, delivery boy, lights out later. The last entry she underlined twice. "Later," she murmured. "That simply will not do." At that moment, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, entered with a tray of tea and a plate of shortbread. "You've been at it all afternoon, Jane," she said kindly. "Do stop and have something warm." Miss Marple smiled up at her. "Oh, thank you, dear. I'm only trying to keep the facts tidy before they become muddled. It's rather like knitting, really. Drop a stitch early on and you'll have trouble by the time you reach the cuff." Mrs. Clement chuckled. "You mean you think someone's dropped a stitch?" "I think," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea, "that Mrs. Price is knitting a pattern of her own design. She claimed the lights returned before the door closed, but if they went out at 8:10, as Mrs. Weatherby swears, then the back door could not have opened after. So she's mistaken." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps she would rather not say who used that door." They sat a moment in companionable quiet, the sound of the wind brushing against the glass. Then Miss Marple reached again for her notes. "The lavender scent troubles me too. Miss Bartlett never wore perfume, but it was present faintly in 2 accounts." "Either someone carried it or spilled it," Mrs. Clement frowned. "Spilled it? In a salon?" "Lavender water can mask many smells," Miss Marple replied. "Hair dye, for instance, or something sharper?" The vicar's wife shivered slightly. "You think it was used on purpose?" "I think," Miss Marple said, folding her notebook, "that when people lie, they do it in the smallest ways possible. A wrong minute here, a confused door there. But lies are like curls, my dear. One twist leads inevitably to another." Mrs. Clement smiled faintly, though her eyes held unease. "Then what will you do?" "Oh, nothing at all," Miss Marple said with deceptive mildness. "Not yet. I shall let Mrs. Price talk a little more tomorrow. In St. Mary Mead, truth is rather like gossip. It always comes out, if one listens patiently." Outside, the wind sighed through the hedgerows and the church clock struck 9. Miss Marple looked up, the faintest sparkle in her eyes. "Sometimes," she said half to herself, "a single missed minute can change everything." Chapter 3. The Missing Hairpin. By mid-morning, the snow had returned to St. Mary Mead, dusting the rooftops and hedges in a clean white hush. The village looked innocent again, as though no dark deed had ever disturbed its quiet lanes. Yet, in the snug front parlour of her cottage, Miss Marple sat before the fire, turning over a small object in her gloved hands, a slender silver hairpin set with a single pearl. It glimmered faintly in the hearthlight, delicate yet deliberate, like something meant to be noticed. "It isn't the sort of thing Miss Bartlett would ever keep in her shop," she murmured. "Too fine for her customers and far too expensive to be left lying about." Inspector Craddock, seated opposite her with his notebook, leaned forward to examine it. "Found near the salon chair," he said. "Could have fallen from a client's hair." "Or," Miss Marple replied gently, "it could have been placed there." Vanity, dear Inspector, is a curious motive. People will risk far more for it than they'd admit. Craddock smiled faintly. He had learned not to mistake that mild tone for idle chatter. The silversmith's mark suggests Bath, he said, checking his notes. There's a boutique called Wentworth and Lane. I'll send a man— Do go yourself, Miss Marple interrupted softly. Some details require eyes that notice the unspoken. A clerk will only hear what he's told. He hesitated, then nodded. And you? I shall stay here, she said, and consider who among us takes pleasure in such adornments. After he left, Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea and gazed out at the white street. Mrs. Weatherby passed by, her scarf fluttering like a flag. She wore plain pins, always did. Miss Drew, the timid newcomer, had no family jewels and no vanity to speak of. But Mrs. Price— now there was a woman fond of sparkle, the kind who might admire a trinket simply because it drew the eye. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk, pretending a need for errands. At the grocer's, she lingered by the counter, listening as Mrs. Price chatted with the assistant about the shortage of cream. A quick turn of her head, a glint near her temple. Yes, there it was. A twin to the missing hairpin, perhaps? Or perhaps merely similar enough to stir thought. Such pretty things, hairpins, Miss Marple said lightly. Though I always lose mine, Mrs. Price laughed. Oh, I couldn't do without them, Miss Marple. My niece in Bath sent me these for Christmas. Aren't they lovely? Bath, you say? Miss Marple's tone was mild, her eyes mild too, but inside her mind the pattern clicked into place. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the snow thickened, she sat once more by the fire. The hairpin lay before her on a linen handkerchief, gleaming softly. It seemed almost to whisper its secret into the quiet room. One villager's Christmas gift, she murmured, had gone missing, or been used for murder. The next morning dawned pale and cold. The snow outside Miss Drew's cottage piled high along the fence like folded linen. Inside, the young woman sat by the hearth, hands trembling around a parcel wrapped in brown paper. It had been waiting at her doorstep when she opened the door for milk. No name, no sender, only her own, written neatly across the front in a wavering hand. She turned it over once, twice, before tugging at the string. Inside, nestled in soft tissue, lay a silver hairpin, identical to the one the police had taken from the Salon. A folded slip of paper fell to her lap. In thick, uneven ink, the message read, "You forgot this." Miss Drew's breath caught. The handwriting was crude, but unmistakably male, and her mind darted instantly to the stormy evening at the Salon, the flicker of lights, the faint scent of lavender. She pressed a hand to her mouth, frightened more by what she could not remember than by what she did. Moments later, her shawl thrown hastily around her shoulders, she hurried through the snowy lane to Miss Marple's cottage. The older woman welcomed her in with quiet calm, as though she had expected the visit. "It was on my doorstep," Miss Drew whispered, setting the parcel on the table. "The same kind that Miss Bartlett—" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, unfolding the note. "You forgot this." Her eyes lingered on the shaky script, the uncertain pressure of the pen. How curious. "A reminder." "Or perhaps a warning." Miss Drew twisted her gloves. "Do you think they're watching me?" Miss Marple poured tea into 2 cups, unhurried. "If someone wished you harm, my dear, they would not have sent a gift. Nah, this is conscience at work." Someone close by, uneasy, trying to right a small part of a large wrong. The girl looked up, her face pale against the glow of the fire. "But why me?" "Because," said Miss Marple softly, "you were there. And you saw something, even if you do not yet realize what it was." The cottage clock ticked between them, steady as breath. Miss Drew stared into her cup, trying to summon the memory. The sudden flash when the lights returned, Mrs. Price's voice rising in irritation, Miss Bartlett stooping behind her chair. And, just for an instant, a man's shape in the mirror, not a customer, not meant to be there. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where snowflakes tapped like fingers against the glass. "Someone wanted you to remember something," she said, her tone low and thoughtful. Or perhaps, my dear Miss Drew, someone wanted you to keep quiet. She folded the note again, tucking it carefully into her sleeve. Outside, the wind swept through the lane, carrying with it a faint, familiar trace of lavender water, a scent that should have died with Miss Bartlett, yet lingered like a secret refusing to rest. Chapter 4. Under the Mistletoe. That evening, St. Mary Mead sparkled as though it had decided to forget its troubles, if only for a night. The vicarage glowed with candlelight, wreaths hung on every beam, and the scent of mulled wine mingled with pine and cake. Despite the whisper of tragedy that still lingered like frost, the villagers had come, bundled in scarves and good cheer. After all, Christmas waited for no one, not even sorrow. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 7, her shawl pinned neatly and her eyes bright with mild curiosity. She accepted a cup of punch from the vicar's wife, who, though smiling, kept glancing toward the door each time it opened. Near the fire, Mrs. Price chattered about her pudding recipe, while Mrs. Weatherby stood stiffly beside the Christmas tree, her gloved hands twisting together. The tree was magnificent, tall, fragrant, its branches heavy with ribbons, baubles, and soft white candles that cast a warm glow across the room. But to Miss Marple's sharp eye, one bauble near the centre caught the light differently. It did not shimmer or sparkle like glass. It gleamed with the dull sheen of metal. She drifted closer, greeting Mrs. Weatherby kindly as she passed. "Such a lovely tree this year," she said. "You must have chosen the decorations yourself." Mrs. Weatherby flinched slightly. "Oh, no. The young curate helped. I only hung a few of my own." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the strange ornament, half hidden among silver tinsel. It looked like a small sphere, polished smooth, perhaps hollow. "How thoughtful," she said gently. "It's the personal touches that make things charming." Mrs. Weatherby smiled faintly, though her eyes darted away. The expression was wrong, too cautious, too watchful. Miss Marple sipped her punch and said no more. As the evening unfolded, the vicar gave a speech about community and perseverance. The choir sang, "God rest ye merry gentlemen," their voices soft beneath the crackle of the fire. Conversation flowed, laughter returned, and for a time St. Mary Mead seemed its old self again. Yet Miss Marple remained watchful. She noticed Mrs. Price, flushed and talkative, cornering poor Mr. Briggs near the sideboard, Miss Drew sitting quietly, avoiding eyes, and Mrs. Weatherby slipping once more toward the tree, checking something among its branches. The laughter swelled as the mistletoe was brought out, a sprig held high by the vicar's wife, who declared that Christmas cheer required at least one traditional kiss. The crowd chuckled, and a few good-natured pecks were exchanged amid applause. But Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, watched Mrs. Weatherby again. The woman was pale now, her hand trembling as she reached up toward that false bauble. When the music started, a brisk carol played on the piano, Mrs. Weatherby withdrew her hand and stepped back, smiling too brightly at no one in particular. Miss Marple followed her gaze and saw Inspector Craddock by the door, newly arrived, brushing snow from his coat. Their eyes met, and he gave her a questioning look. She inclined her head, just enough for him to notice. Later, when the dancing began, Miss Marple quietly crossed to the tree. The branches rustled faintly as she reached out and touched the curious ornament. It was cool and heavy beneath her fingers, not glass at all. She smiled slightly, her expression hidden behind the soft candlelight. "One ornament," she whispered, "was not glass, but metal." The vicar's drawing-room was warm with laughter and the sweet, steady rise of music. The villagers sang as though their voices could ward off the cold pressing at the windows. Candles flickered, shadows danced, and the faint scent of cinnamon drifted through the air. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth, pretended to hum along, while her gaze lingered thoughtfully on Mrs. Weatherby, who stood by the window with a posture far too rigid for such a merry song. When the final verse ended and applause broke out, Mrs. Weatherby turned quickly away, her gloved hands twisting one another. Miss Marple rose and moved to her side, speaking in her mildest tone. My dear, you look quite done in. May I fetch you a little something to steady your nerves?" Mrs. Weatherby gave a brittle laugh. "Oh, Miss Marple, how perceptive you always are."
"Perfectly fine." Her eyes, however, glimmered with the sheen of tears.
"Only this dreadful weather, perhaps."
"And the news, of course." "Quite understandable," said softly.
A good many of us still feel unsettled, but sometimes, a quiet word helps far more than silence. There was a long pause before Mrs. Weatherby nodded faintly. "Perhaps a word, then?" she murmured, allowing Miss Marple to guide her into a smaller sitting room off the hall. The noise of carols dulled behind the closed door, leaving only the ticking of a clock and the faraway murmur of voices. Mrs. Weatherby sank into a chair, her posture collapsing under the weight of what she had carried. "It wasn't meant to happen," she began, her voice trembling. "Years ago, before my George died, Miss Bartlett found something. Letters, foolish things he'd written to another woman, long before he married me. They meant nothing truly, but she threatened to tell. Said she couldn't abide deceit." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap.
"And you asked her not to?" "I begged her." Mrs. Weatherby's voice cracked.
"She agreed in the end, said it would go no further. But every Christmas after she'd remind me, some little remark, some sly reference."
"Oh, she enjoyed it, the power of it." She pressed a handkerchief to her eye.
"When I heard she'd been found, I was horrified, yes, but also relieved. Isn't that dreadful of me?" Miss Marple's expression was kind, her tone as gentle as snow falling outside.
"Not dreadful, my dear. Only human." Mrs. Weatherby drew a shaking breath. "I didn't kill her. I couldn't. But I wanted it to stop. The whispers, the looks."
I told her so that night at the Salon. We argued and I knocked something from her table. A vase, I think. Then the lights went out and I left. "Leaving your hairpin behind," Miss Marple said quietly. Mrs. Weatherby looked up sharply.
"How did you—"
"A tree, my dear. One ornament was not glass but metal, and I suspect you hid it there before the inspector arrived." The woman's eyes filled with tears again, but there was something like relief in them now. "I thought it safer there than in my drawer." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Secrets like mistletoe often grow where they're least wanted. Best to trim them early before they take root." Outside, the choir struck up another carol, Silent Night drifting softly through the door. Mrs. Weatherby wept quietly into her handkerchief, the firelight trembling over her face. Miss Marple sat beside her in silence, her gaze distant yet steady, as if she were already fitting one final piece into a puzzle that only she could see. Chapter 5. Footprints in the Snow. The morning after the vicar's party, St. Mary Mead lay still beneath a thick white quilt. The village roofs gleamed like sugar icing, the lanes muffled and soft. Only the faint chiming of the church clock broke the hush. Miss Marple, wrapped warmly in her grey coat and wool scarf, walked with careful steps toward the village green, her mind already turning over the night's conversation. The Golden Comb stood silent under its snow-laden eaves, its windows shuttered, its signs swinging gently in the chill wind. A policeman stood by the door, stamping his boots to keep warm, and nodded respectfully as she approached.
"Inspector said you might come, Miss Marple."
"Thought you'd like a look round the back before the snow melts." "Very sensible of him," she said, her eyes brightening. "Snow, preserves everything, even guilt." The path behind the salon wound between two fences, a narrow passage where no one ventured except for deliveries and the occasional stray cat. Miss Marple followed it, her umbrella tapping softly against the snowdrifts. The flakes had stopped falling for a few hours, leaving the surface crisp and undisturbed, except where the prints began. 2 sets of them. Clear, deliberate steps pressed deep into the white crust. One path led toward the salon's back door, the other away. The entering steps were neat, measured. The ones leaving were heavier, hurried, as though the person had run. Yet, only halfway down the passage, the outgoing footprints simply stopped. Miss Marple paused, her breath rising in small clouds.
"How peculiar," she murmured.
In snow, every lie leaves its mark, until the wind decides otherwise. She crouched a little, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of the final print. Beyond it, the snow was smooth, untouched.
No signs of jumping, slipping, or doubling back.
The surface shimmered with tiny frozen crystals, reflecting the pale light of morning. It was as though the person had stepped neatly out of existence. Inspector Craddock arrived a moment later, crunching over the path. "You've seen it, then?" he said. "We followed it last night. Same thing, just stops. No direction, no trail beyond this point." Miss Marple straightened slowly. "You examined the fences? High and topped with wire. Too steep for anyone in their right mind to climb. Unless," she said softly, "they didn't need to climb. Perhaps they opened something instead." Craddock frowned. "A door? Or a gate?" she said. Her gaze travelled along the fence until she found what she sought, a narrow wooden panel, warped and half-concealed beneath a hedge. She brushed snow from its latch and smiled faintly. People forget these little shortcuts, but the villagers, they always know them. Craddock bent to examine it.
"Opens onto the old footpath behind the rectory," he muttered.
"We'll check it." As he stepped away, Miss Marple remained still, her thoughts sifting like snowflakes. The footprints told their story clearly enough. Someone had entered the salon quietly, perhaps with a key, and left in haste through the back, vanishing into the storm. But there was something else, something about the weight and distance of the steps. Not a large man's stride, nor a woman's short tread, something in between.
Someone uncertain.
She turned back toward the silent building. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, as if the snow itself waited to be asked a question. A small smile curved her lips. "Snow may hide the truth for a time," she murmured, "but only for those who stop looking." By mid-afternoon, the village stirred to life again. The morning stillness had given way to cautious chatter, people sweeping snow from doorsteps, children tossing handfuls of powder into the air, and the faint clatter of the postman's bicycle bell echoing down the lane. Miss Marple stood by her garden gate waiting for him as though it were any other day. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully, though his face looked tired. "Bit of a chill in the air again." "Indeed," she replied, "and such weather has a way of keeping secrets fresh. You were on duty last evening, I believe." The postman shifted uncomfortably, his breath misting in the cold. "Yes, ma'am. Worked a bit late, what with the Christmas rush." "Why do you ask?" "I wonder," Miss Marple said kindly, "whether any deliveries took you past the Golden Comb after closing." He blinked, his eyes flicking down the lane toward the silent salon.
"Now that you mention it, yes."
"There was one. Brown parcel, smallish. Addressed to Miss L. Bartlett. Urgent," it said in big letters.
No return name, though, and I remember thinking that was odd. Was Miss Bartlett inside when you delivered it?
He hesitated. "Didn't see her myself. Lights were on in the front, but the back door was open, so I left it there on the steps."
"Heard voices, too. Thought she had company. Voices."
Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her blue eyes were sharp.
"A woman's? A man's?"
"Man's," he said after a moment. Couldn't make out words, only the tone. Sounded cross, though. I remember thinking I wouldn't trade places with whoever was getting that talking to. She nodded thoughtfully. "And after that?" "Well, nothing.
I rode off home."
Didn't think of it again until I heard what happened." He rubbed the back of his neck. "The thing is, the inspector asked about packages this morning, but when they went looking, there wasn't any parcel."
"Not a bit of it missing, Miss Marple." "How very interesting," the postman frowned. "Could have been taken before they searched, I suppose."
"Or tossed out, perhaps." Her voice was gentle. But she was already piecing it together in her mind. A parcel left on a back step. A man's voice, a body found hours later.
And snow that recorded every footstep but one.
"You've been most helpful," she said warmly. "Do take care on those icy roads." After he departed, Miss Marple lingered by the gate, her thoughts quiet and steady. A parcel marked urgent.
No sender's note. Vanished before dawn.
Such things did not simply disappear, they were made to disappear. She pictured the brown paper tied with string, the crisp label bearing Miss Bartlett's name. Perhaps it had held a trinket, or a letter, or something far less innocent. Later, at the police station, Inspector Craddock listened grimly as she relayed the tale. "We checked the salon top to bottom," he said. "Nothing like that turned up. Then someone removed it," Miss Marple said. "Likely after she died, perhaps before anyone thought to lock the door. Someone who knew what was inside," Craddock sighed. "And you've a theory, I suppose?" She smiled faintly, only that whatever was inside that parcel was worth a life. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and unhurried, covering the village in a fresh white hush. But Miss Marple's eyes remained bright and knowing, for snow, she thought, could bury a great many things, but never the truth. Chapter 6. Threads of Truth. It was late, and the wind had dropped to a whisper outside. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her notebook open on her lap, the flickering light dancing across her face. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, the only sound besides the faint hiss of the logs. A teapot steamed gently beside her, forgotten in her concentration. On the small table lay the objects she had gathered: a silver hairpin, a single metal button, and the folded note that had come to Miss Drew. So harmless in appearance, and yet, together, they whispered the truth. She reread her notes from the beginning. The parcel, delivered after hours, addressed to Miss Bartlett. The lavender scent that lingered in the salon. The vanished footprints, ending at the hedge. The false ornament on the vicar's tree, hollow and full of secrets. Each thread glimmered separately, until one detail pulled them tight.
Lavender water?
Miss Bartlett never wore it. Yet it had clung to her skin, to the room, to the objects found after her death.
Lavender water? And who used it daily?
Miss Marple's lips pursed in thought. Nora Finch, the young assistant at the Salon. Quiet, polite, almost invisible. She had worked late that evening, tidying up after the last clients, no doubt alone when Miss Bartlett stayed behind. No one ever looked at her twice. People rarely did. Miss Marple turned the silver hairpin over in her fingers. Nora's wages would never stretch to such a trinket, but she might have seen it, coveted it, perhaps even borrowed it. And the note to Miss Drew, the shaky, uncertain handwriting that pretended to frighten but carried guilt instead. Nora had written it not to warn but to confess in disguise. She wanted to unburden herself without speaking. The thought was so simple it was almost kind. Miss Marple drew a neat line beneath her notes.
Nora Finch, she murmured.
You poor foolish girl. The most invisible people see the most, and sometimes they see too much. She rose and crossed to the window, parting the lace curtain. The village slept beneath its blanket of snow, chimneys smoking, lamplight glowing faintly behind drawn curtains. St. Mary Mead looked so peaceful that one could almost believe evil had no place there. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Evil in her experience preferred peaceful places.
They hid it so well.
Her gaze lingered on the faint outline of the salon across the square, its sign now dimmed, its windows black. Somewhere in that little room, the truth still waited. Nora had stayed behind, perhaps to tidy, perhaps to confront Miss Bartlett about the stolen parcel. Miss Bartlett, ever the moralist, would not have kept such silence easily.
Harsh words, an accusation, a struggle, and then a single blow.
The lavender bottle shattering, the scent spilling everywhere, marking guilt as surely as ink. Miss Marple closed her notebook with care. She felt no triumph, only a gentle sadness. Nora had likely meant only to frighten, not to kill. But fear and desperation were a dangerous mix, especially for someone who had spent a lifetime being ignored. Outside, a church bell struck midnight, its sound clear and slow through the frosty air. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. Tomorrow she would speak to Inspector Craddock. But tonight she allowed herself a moment of quiet sympathy for the girl who had wanted to be seen, and had been seen at last. The next morning dawned grey and brittle, the kind of cold that made windows bloom with frost. Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer and made her way along the narrow lane toward Nora Finch's cottage. It was a modest place on the edge of the village, whitewashed walls, a crooked chimney, and a small garden now buried in snow. Smoke drifted from the flue, but the light inside flickered uncertainly, as if its inhabitant couldn't decide whether to welcome the day. Nora answered the knock almost at once. Her eyes were rimmed red, her hands trembling around the edge of her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, voice cracking. "I was afraid it might be you." "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, stepping inside. "I thought perhaps we might talk. There are some things better said by a warm fire than kept to chill the heart." The girl hesitated but nodded, leading her guest into a small sitting room. The space was neat though worn. A few faded photographs stood on the mantel, and a single vase of dried lavender filled the air with its faint, bittersweet scent. Miss Marple noticed Nora's glance dart toward it, then away. "You've had a trying week, I imagine," Miss Marple began, easing herself into a chair. "Poor Miss Bartlett's death has unsettled the whole village." Nora sat opposite, twisting her apron in her lap.
"I didn't mean for anything bad to happen," she said quickly, her voice thin as a thread.
She was angry that evening, said dreadful things." Miss Marple nodded gently. "She could be sharp when she wished, and yet one wonders why she had cause to speak so to you." Nora's eyes filled before she could stop them.
"She knew," she whispered.
"About Mr. Carter. He's married. He was kind to me, that's all. But she saw us once in Bath. She said she'd tell his wife unless I did what she wanted." "Money?" Miss Marple asked, her tone calm, almost kind. Nora shook her head. "Not money. Favours, errands, delivering parcels that weren't mine. I never asked what was inside, but one of them was for her sister in Bath. I swear I didn't know it was wrong. When she said she'd tell everyone..." She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth.
"I begged her not to. And that evening?"
Miss Marple prompted softly. "She sent me home early," Nora said. "Said she had to stay for a delivery."
"I left before the lights went out."
"But someone else came after. I heard footsteps near the back lane when I reached the corner."
"I thought nothing of it then." Miss Marple leaned forward, eyes bright beneath her lace cap.
"You didn't kill her, Nora. I believe you."
"But someone knew of that secret. And secrets, my dear, are the most dangerous things in any village." Nora looked up, startled.
"You mean someone else knew about Mr. Carter?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her gaze distant.
"Oh, I think someone knew far more than that."
"And before this Christmas is done, we shall see how far love and fear can walk together." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, covering every trace of guilt beneath its perfect white hush. Chapter 7. The Man with the Gloves. The wind carried a brittle chill through St. Mary Mead, stirring the edges of frost that clung to hedges and rooftops. Inspector Craddock's boots crunched over the icy cobblestones as he approached the Golden Comb once more. The police tape had long since sagged, a forlorn banner across the shop front.
Inside everything was still, but for Craddock, questions lingered like ghosts.
One in particular had just found its face. At the vicarage, he met Miss Marple, who sat by the fire with her knitting, as serene as ever. "You look as though you've seen an apparition," she said mildly. "Close enough," replied Craddock, rubbing his gloved hands together. "A man's turned up asking questions about the Salon. Said he used to know Miss Bartlett. Name of Mr. Alan Firth. Ring any bells?" Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Firth," she repeated thoughtfully. "Wasn't he Mr. Weatherby's partner once, in that little import business? The one that failed rather suddenly?" "Exactly. He left the country after the bankruptcy," said Craddock, "supposedly to start fresh in Canada. Turns out he's been back a fortnight. Says he came to see Mrs. Weatherby about some unfinished accounts." Miss Marple's eyes lifted, mild but sharp, "and instead found himself near the Salon on Christmas Eve." Craddock nodded grimly. "A witness," the milkman, "saw him walking down the lane just after 8. Said he wore dark clothes and gloves. When we questioned Firth, he admitted he passed by, claimed he'd stopped to post a letter."
"But there's something else."
"Fibres from a pair of men's wool gloves were found by the broken ornament inside the Salon. They match the make he wears." Miss Marple set her knitting aside.
"Christmas brings back ghosts," she murmured. "Some wearing gloves." Craddock allowed himself a wry smile.
"You think he came back for revenge?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that people rarely return without reason. The season gives us excellent excuses, calm old debts, dressed as holiday visits." They walked together to the village green. The afternoon light was pale, touching every branch and rooftop with delicate silver. Children skated on the frozen pond, their laughter echoing faintly against the cottages. It was a picture of peace. And yet, Craddock felt the undercurrent of unease that Miss Marple so often sensed before anyone else. They found Firth at the inn, a tall man with thinning hair and a nervous air. He stood when they entered, though his smile wavered under the weight of the inspector's gaze.
"I told your constable everything," he said quickly.
"I was only passing through." Craddock gestured for him to sit. Passing through seems to have a way of leading people straight into murder inquiries. Firth flushed, his gloved hands tightening around his cup. "I had no quarrel with Miss Bartlett. None. But you quarrelled with Mr. Weatherby," Miss Marple said, softly.
"Over money, I believe."
And wasn't Miss Bartlett one of the few who knew the truth of that affair? His eyes flickered towards her, startled. "How could you possibly—" "Villagers remember," she said simply. "And so do old friends." For a moment the man's facade faltered. Then he rose abruptly, muttering about catching a train. Craddock moved to block his path. "You'll stay nearby until we sort this out." When he was gone, Miss Marple watched the doorway thoughtfully.
"A man with gloves," she murmured, "and far too many secrets for a casual visit." Craddock frowned.
"You think he's our killer?" "I think," said Miss Marple, retrieving her knitting, "that he's the key to someone else's guilt. In St. Mary Mead, Inspector, even the most well-dressed ghosts seldom walk alone." Snowflakes drifted lazily outside as Miss Marple arranged the chairs within the golden comb. The mirrors had been polished, the air faintly scented with lavender, though not Miss Bartlett's own. It had been Miss Marple's idea, of course, to host what she called a small memorial trimming. The village needed closure, she said, a little gathering to remember their dear hairdresser. But in truth, she was preparing a far gentler form of justice. By mid-afternoon, the key figures had arrived. Mrs. Weatherby, her gloved hands trembling slightly. Miss Anne Drew, pale and quiet. Nora Finch, twisting a handkerchief in her lap. And Mr. Alan Firth, who sat apart, pretending nonchalance. Even Inspector Craddock lingered near the doorway, more curious than he cared to admit. "Tea first," said Miss Marple, smiling warmly as she poured. "It's a sad thing losing someone in so festive a season. I always think tea helps when words cannot." As the cups clinked and the hum of small talk filled the air, Miss Marple moved about the salon, adjusting the blinds, tapping the counter, straightening a comb here, a brush there. Her eyes never stopped observing. She noted how Mrs. Weatherby's gaze darted toward the dressing table, how Mr. Firth's leg jiggled with restless energy, and how poor Nora flinched each time the floor creaked beneath her chair. When the tea was done, Miss Marple set down her cup and sighed softly. "It's strange," she began, "how moments repeat themselves. Christmas Eve, this very room, a knock at the door, laughter, the lights flickering."
"I wonder," she added, turning toward Mrs. Weatherby, "how the lights seemed to go out just when Miss Bartlett bent to tidy the drawer." Mrs. Weatherby looked startled. I don't recall," she stammered.
"There was thunder, wasn't there?"
"Yes," said Miss Marple gently.
"But no storm." The others glanced at one another uneasily. Miss Marple's tone was calm, almost kind. "You see," she went on, "the drawer still bears a faint mark of lavender water. Someone spilled it, trying to mask another scent, perhaps that of the polish used on a gentleman's gloves." Mr. Firth bristled.
"Are you implying—" "Oh, not at all," said Miss Marple.
"But I do think someone feared those gloves might be recognized."
"And so they hid them here, in this very drawer, just before the lights went out." A hush fell.
Even the ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder. Miss Marple turned toward Craddock. "Would you be so kind," she said, "as to dim the lights? I believe this may help us recall what happened." The inspector hesitated, then obliged. The room sank into a soft half-darkness, shadows flickering across the mirrors. Miss Marple waited, patient as snowfall, and then it happened. A faint scrape, a hand moving through air. Someone reached instinctively toward the drawer. Craddock snapped the lights back on. Mrs. Weatherby froze, her fingers still resting on the handle. Her face went as white as the snow outside.
I only meant to steady myself." Miss Marple's voice was quiet, almost sorrowful.
"No, my dear, you meant to hide the gloves again, didn't you?" Miss Bartlett discovered they were your husband's, stained, from an accident that wasn't an accident at all. She threatened to tell the truth, and you silenced her. Tears welled in Mrs. Weatherby's eyes as the room held its breath.
It was supposed to be forgotten, she whispered.
Alan knew, we both knew, but she wouldn't let it rest. In darkness, Miss Marple said softly, truth finds its courage. As the constable led Mrs. Weatherby away, the snow outside thickened, blanketing St. Mary Mead in a hush so pure it seemed to forgive everything but the truth. Chapter 8. The Truth Beneath the Glitter. Morning light shimmered over St. Mary Mead, turning the frost into tiny diamonds across the rooftops. The village was quiet again, as though the night's turmoil had been folded neatly away like a finished garment. In the sitting room of her cottage, Miss Marple poured tea for Inspector Craddock, whose weary expression hinted at a sleepless night. "It's remarkable," he said, shaking his head. "All that theatre in the Salon, and yet the truth slipped right through our fingers. Mrs. Weatherby wasn't the killer." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, she was frightened, yes, but not murderous. She only wished to protect what she thought was already lost." Craddock leaned forward.
"Then who, Firth?"
"Mr. Alan Firth," she said gently. "Never went abroad as he claimed. He lingered, in debt, desperate, and still tethered to Mr. Weatherby's business. You see, Miss Bartlett had uncovered his little scheme before her death. Embezzlement, of course. The accounts never balanced, and Miss Bartlett, being rather sharper than most, gave her credit for, noticed the missing figures when she helped tally donations for the Christmas fund." Craddock frowned.
"So she threatened to expose him?" "Not directly," Miss Marple replied.
"She merely asked a few questions in the wrong company, teeing which in a small village is as dangerous as shouting from the church steeple." Firth panicked. "He came back on Christmas Eve intending to silence her before she could speak to you." Craddock exhaled slowly.
"And the lavender scent?"
"A clever touch," said Miss Marple, pouring more tea. "He found a gift box of lavender water Nora Finch had left behind at the Salon. It belonged to her late mother. He dabbed it on his gloves to disguise the smell of the leather polish, but such disguises never hold. Miss Bartlett, being fastidious about her scents, recognized it at once. That moment of recognition was her undoing." Craddock rubbed his chin. "He used her trust against her." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. He waited until she turned her back to lock the drawer, then struck. "When the lights flickered, not from thunder but from the faulty wiring we saw yesterday, he panicked and dropped the ornament. A single mistake, but enough for the truth to leave its trail." Craddock sat back, admiration softening his features. "You never miss a thread, do you?" "Oh, I miss plenty," Miss Marple said modestly. "But people, they always tell you who they are, one way or another. Mr. Firth's gloves were expensive, too fine for a man in his supposed condition."
"Vanity, dear Inspector, often betrays the guilty." They sat in companionable silence as the kettle began to whistle again.
Outside, the village stirred to life. Mrs. Bantry hurried past with a basket of letters. Children carried sleds toward the green. It was as if the air itself had softened. Craddock rose, pulling on his coat. "We'll bring Firth in before noon. He's been staying at the inn. Claimed he wanted to settle old debts." "Seems he's settled one too many." Miss Marple nodded. "Tell him," she said, her voice as gentle as ever, "that justice in St. Mary Mead moves as quietly as snow, but it never fails to fall." Craddock smiled, tipping his hat.
"You should have been a detective."
"Miss Marple." "Oh, my dear," she said, returning to her knitting.
"I've been one far too long already." As he left,
Miss Marple looked out at the street, where frost sparkled like tinsel on the hedges. Every glittering thing hides a shadow, she thought. Yet even shadows, when faced with daylight, must learn to tell the truth. Snow fell in slow, steady flakes over St. Mary Mead, blanketing the rooftops and lanes in gentle white. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the church bells began to ring again. Not hurried this time, but soft and low, as if the village itself was sighing with relief. Inside the vicarage the fire glowed warmly, and Miss Marple sat opposite the vicar, her hands cupped around a delicate china teacup painted with holly leaves. "Well," said the vicar with a long breath. It's all over then. Quite dreadful, the business with Miss Bartlett.
I never should have thought such a thing could happen here. Not in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple smiled faintly, the lines around her eyes deepening. That's what everyone always says, dear, she murmured.
But human nature doesn't change with the scenery. It's the same in London as it is in a tiny village. Vanity, pride, and love, they're the true mischief makers.
Murder merely borrows their stage. The vicar nodded thoughtfully, stirring his tea.
You think it was vanity then?
Not greed?
Oh, greed wears many disguises, said Miss Marple. Sometimes it dresses itself in the wish to be admired, or to be forgiven, or simply not to be found out. Mr. Firth wished to restore his name, to pretend he was still the man he once claimed to be. And poor Miss Bartlett, she wished to be respected, to hold power for once in her life. They were both, in their ways, prisoners of appearances. The vicar gazed into the fire.
And Mrs. Weatherby? A good heart, said Miss Marple softly.
But a frightened one. She'd built her marriage upon an illusion, and when that illusion cracked, she did what many do. She tried to mend it with silence. Outside, a faint laughter drifted through the frosty air. Children playing on the green, their sleds leaving winding trails through the snow. The sound seemed to lighten the room. Miss Marple smiled again and set her cup down on its saucer.
The village will heal, she said.
It always does. Christmas is quite good at mending what people break. The vicar leaned back with a small smile. You're rather fond of Christmas, aren't you?
Oh, indeed, said Miss Marple, eyes twinkling.
It's the one time of year when people reveal themselves most plainly. Some wrap love in ribbon and paper, others hide regret beneath mistletoe. But it all comes out, one way or another. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind brushing against the windows. The bells faded, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock. Miss Marple reached for another cup of tea, her movements unhurried, her expression serene. You know, said the vicar after a pause.
You've quite the gift for understanding people, Miss Marple chuckled softly. Oh, I don't understand them, dear. I just listen.
People will always tell you what they are, given enough time and enough tea. The vicar laughed, shaking his head. And enough patience. Patience, she said, and a little curiosity. Outside, the last of the afternoon light turned the snow to gold. A robin landed on the windowsill, its breast bright as a berry, pecking at the frost. Miss Marple watched it, her expression peaceful. Some secrets melt away like snow, she said at last, her voice almost a whisper.
Others linger. You're like the scent of lavender. The vicar smiled. A fitting ending, Miss Marple. She raised her cup gently.
Not an ending, my dear. Only another story waiting for its beginning. And as the snow continued to fall, St. Mary Mead lay wrapped in quiet grace, its mysteries, for now, at rest. This is Sam, signing out from Detective Notebook.